Welcome to Animal Cognition, Lecture 11, Part 1. In this lecture we're going to introduce the topic of navigation, and we're going to focus on short distance navigation, and what I mean by that is basically navigating around a home range instead of the long distance navigation that's involved in, for example, migration. So in this part we're going to discuss different mechanisms that animals can use to navigate around a home range, focusing on cognitive maps and the use of landmarks. And in the second part we're going to turn our attention to animals possibly using a sun compass and dead reckoning to get around a home range. First, let's start off with a brief definition. Navigation, as I'm sure you know, involves figuring out our current position and from there being able to plot a course to another specific location. So it's figuring out where you are and how to get wherever it is that you want to go. And this ability is very important, not just for humans but also for other animals, because resources are often distributed spatially throughout the environment. You find different things in different locations, and so do animals, and they have to be able to get to these different locations to get everything they need. For example, foods are located in different regions, water, nests, potential mates, these may be spread out across different locations, and an animal has to be able to navigate to get to each of those. And it's important to be able to do this accurately because failure to do so can mean wasting precious time and energy. So as I said, the distances involved in navigation can be quite vast, as when animals engage in migration, or they can also be relatively short distances, right? Like when animals are navigating to get around their home range. And it's the short distance navigation that's going to form the part of this lecture. So navigating around a home range. So for example, an animal might leave its nest in search of food or water and then have to find their way back home. So the question is, how does an animal represent his or her home range? Right? How is this area that it lives represented? Do they create a detailed cognitive map of the home range, or do they simply represent certain landmarks and what to do around those landmarks? Do they use beacons, for example, or do they engage in dead reckoning or exploit a sun compass? And what we're going to see is that there's lots of potential mechanisms that animals can use, and some animals use some mechanisms, other animals use others, and in many cases they're also able to use lots of different mechanisms in different situations or at different parts of a journey. But I want to start with a discussion of cognitive maps. So when researchers first started to look at animal cognition and navigation, one of the first ideas that they came up with is that animals navigate by using a cognitive map. And a cognitive map is basically an integrated spatial representation. Right? It's a representation of various objects that include landmarks, beacons, different routes to be taken, right, in the environment, and it also includes the distance and direction between each of these components. So if you think about a physical map that's that represents different locations and the different spatial relations between them, then you have a pretty good analogy for what a cognitive map might be like. So it's basically like an overview, like an overhead view that animals can use to orient themselves within this space. They can say, I'm here, and to get there I need to take this particular route. So one of the first researchers to postulate cognitive maps was Tolman, and he thought that it is essential to postulate cognitive maps to explain the behavior of rats in his maze experiments. Right, so the mazes that he devised included multiple routes and these different routes could be blocked, and he would see whether animals automatically take another route to get to a goal location. So here's an example of a maze that Tolman designed. You can see it's got a starting location and then 3 different routes to get to a location where food is stored. And so there's Route 1, Route 2, and Route 3, and these routes could each be blocked at different points. Right, you could set up a block at either A, B, or C. So before any blocks were put in, the rats were allowed to explore the maze. The point being that this would allow them to create a cognitive map. And then, once they had explored this maze, food was placed in the goal location, and then Tolman systematically blocked different routes. So without any blocks, the rats preferred Route 1. Why? Because it is a much more direct route to the food source. But if the maze was blocked at location A, the rats automatically took Route 2, right, the next shortest route. And if both 1 and 2 were blocked, the rats automatically took Route C, right, without any kind of trial and error learning. Okay, so Tolman claimed that the rats had created a cognitive map. They learned this cognitive map as they explored the maze, and that they used it to reason about which route to take when they found that certain routes had been blocked. But one of the main problems with Tolman's study is that he failed to control for the possibility that the rats could have been using other factors in order to navigate instead of relying on a cognitive map. In particular, they could have used a beacon, right, a sign, some kind of location that they could have simply moved towards, right? So beacons are salient stimuli that an animal can try to move towards. So if you think, for example, about a lighthouse, that can be used as a beacon, for example, because you can move towards it or you can move away from it, right, if you don't want to strike land. So in the case of Tolman's experiments, what he failed to account for was the fact that there was a light bulb hanging from the ceiling over the goal box. So it's possible that the rats were simply moving in a way to minimize the distance between themselves and this beacon, right? So they could have been using that in order to get to the food instead of relying on this integrated cognitive map. So one of the lessons from this research is that studies that appeal to cognitive maps can often be explained in a more deflationary way. And what I mean by that is that quite often the results can be explained by attributing simpler representations, less detailed internal representations. Okay. And one of the more interesting applications of this concept of a cognitive map has been the case of honeybees. Right? So honeybees were originally said to use cognitive maps. As we know, for example, honeybees, they forage for food, right? They leave their hive and they go exploring for food, different flowers, and in some cases water when it's needed. And then when they bring this food back to the hive, they communicate via what's called a waggle dance. They indicate to the other bees the distance and location to different food sources. So the idea is that bees have a cognitive map, and based on what the waggle dance tells them, they know where in this cognitive map the food is to be found. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the waggle dance more later on. One of the first researchers to postulate the idea that bees have a cognitive map was Gould. And what he did to demonstrate this was that he trained bees to feed at a certain station located on a boat, a feeding station placed on a boat. And this feeding station was located at different distances from the hive, but also at different positions on the lake. So it's either on one side of the lake or the other, or it occupied positions somewhere in the middle of the lake. And the question that he asked is, can bees that feed in these different locations, can they go back to the hive and actually recruit other bees to feed at that location? And what they found was that when the boat was placed in the center of the lake, right, bees were not very successful at recruiting other bees to those food sources. Right? But when the boat was placed close to either shore, many bees were able to be recruited. Right? So the bees were able to convince other bees to go to those locations. So the way that Gould explained this is that the bees have a detailed internal map, right, of their home range, and this map includes the location of this giant lake. And so with that, and the reason why bees are unable to get other bees to go to those locations is because the bees consult this map and realize, you can't have food in the middle of a lake, right? It doesn't make any sense. So although this was taken as supporting the idea that bees have cognitive maps, I should point out that this particular study was never replicated. I refer to Ray and colleagues for this discussion. Right, so I want to turn now to another possibility of what animals can use in navigating instead of cognitive maps, and this is the idea of a landmark. Right, so rather than having a detailed integrated map that includes all the landmarks on it and the spatial relations between them, maybe animals just store landmarks in their memory and what to do when they get to different landmarks. Right, so landmarks are objects in the environment that can be used to plot a route to a goal. Right, so for example, you can use landmarks as follows, right, like to give directions. When you see the big apple tree, that would be landmark 1, turn left, and then when you get to the giant green barn, which would be the second landmark, turn right and keep going until you get to the house on the hill, which would be the third landmark. So in this, using this kind of thing, you wouldn't need a detailed cognitive map. You just need to know what the landmarks are and what you need to do when you get to each landmark. Right, so you don't need if an animal uses something like this, they don't need to construct a global integrated representation of the entire area. Right, it just has to store landmarks and what to do when they are encountered. And one of the first researchers to explore this idea of animals using landmarks was Tinbergen. And he used landmarks in his study of digger wasps. And as you know, digger wasps build underground nests, and they stuff prey in these nests for their larvae to feed on when they're born. So the question is, well, how do they know, since it's a little hole in the ground, how do they know where their nests are located? And what Tinbergen did was he placed a ring of pine cones around the nests, which the wasps could see when they left the nest. Right? And when the wasps left the nest, what he would do is he would move this ring of pine cones to a different position, and then he would see that when the wasp comes back, it goes in the wrong direction. Right? It flies in a direction different from its nest. And what this suggests is that they're using the ring of pine cones as a landmark for identifying their nest. And you can see the situation up here in figure A. That's the original situation. You can see the wasp leaves its nest, it flies around, it sees the ring, and then while the wasp is gone, he has moved the ring of pine cones off to the right, and then when the bee comes back, it goes in the wrong direction. There's also been more recent studies with honeybees, not wasps, that have found that bees can also use landmarks in addition to other features in order to return to a food source. Right? So when a bee finds a food source that it likes to return there until that food source is depleted. And what the research suggests is that landmarks for desirable food sources are learned, they're memorized, when the bees perform what's called the turn back and look response. Right? So when they leave a food source, right, rather than flying directly away, they'll turn and they'll spend some time scanning the area, presumably encoding what the key landmarks are around that food source. And these are also called learning flights. So Way and Dyer did a study looking at landmark use in honeybees, and they tested the conditions under which honeybees performed the learning flights, and they did so in a lab setting, and they also looked at the consequences of that of those flight durations. So we can kind of see a schematic here of what their lab setup looked like. We have the hive off to the left, we have a camera mount on the right, along with different landmarks, and in the center we have 8 different locations where food of different types could be located, right? So they would vary the location where they put the food, for example. So the idea is the bee will feed, they'll find that food source, and when they leave it, they'll study it and then go back to the hive. So what they found is that the duration of learning flights, right, so how long they perform that turn back and look response, it predicted the accuracies of the bees being able to return to the location where the food had been presented. Right? Greater duration means greater accuracy. And interestingly, they also found 3 factors affect the likelihood of the bees performing these learning flights, this turn back and look response. First, when they are introduced to a new food source. Right? So if it's the same food source in the same location presented over and over again, they're less likely to make the response. But if all of a sudden you change the type of food that it is, for example, a different flower, all of a sudden they'll be more likely to make that learning flight. Also, when the distribution of food is altered from what it was originally. So for example, if the food is moved to a slightly different location, they're going to be more likely to make that learning flight. And also, finally, when there's a sudden change in the quality of the food. So if the food becomes much better or much worse, they're much more likely to make that turn back and look response. Okay, so these are the conditions under which they're more likely to turn back and look, and then memorize locations of the landmarks. Alright, so in today's class we discussed short distance navigation, and we looked at 2 general strategies that animals can use to engage in this kind of short distance navigation around a home range. We looked at cognitive maps, and we also looked at the exploitation of landmarks by wasps and bees.